Good evening. My name is Shramana Biswas. I welcome you to the Stories of Tribal Identity and Culture that will explore the role of tribal literature and tribal representation in literature in shaping cultural identity and ideology, curated under TMYS Review December 2023 in collaboration with the Center of Asia Pacific Initiatives, University of Victoria. We are also calling for submission of essays, poems, and short stories under the project. To know more about the submission guidelines and the project architecture, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. This evening, I consider myself very privileged to be in the company of our esteemed panelists, Dr. Ward Churchill, Dr. Payal Datta Chaudhuri, and Dr. Judy Datta, who will shortly share their views and insights with us. The topic for today's discussion is stereotyping of Indigenous community in literature, defamiliarizing and othering of identity. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker for the session is Dr. Ward Churchill. Ward Churchill was a member of the Leadership Council of Colorado from 1980 to 2009 and a national spokesperson for the Leonard Peltier Defense Committee during the mid-90s. The author and editor of more than 20 books and well over 100 articles, he was professor of American Indian Studies and chair of the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder until his retirement in 2007. We are delighted to have you on the panel, sir. Thank you for joining us this evening. Our second speaker for the session is Dr. Payal Datta Chaudhuri. Payal Datta Chaudhuri teaches literature at Reva University, Bangalore. She takes active interest in the indigenous culture of India's northeast region. Her published works include Lockdown Diary, Stories of Unusual Times, Folktales of India's Northeast, The Nagas' Social and Cultural Identity, Texts and Contexts, The Women of Fulbari and Other Stories, and Dynamics of Self, Family and Community. Her book, The Khasis of Meghalaya, Cultural Continuities and Transformations will be out soon. We are delighted to have you on the panel, ma'am. Thank you for joining us this evening. Our third speaker for the session is Dr. Judy Datta. Dr. Judy Datta is presently working as an assistant professor in the Department of Assamese, Tezpur University, Assam. She did her post-graduation in English and in Assamese from Tezpur University and from Guwahati University, respectively. She was awarded PhD from Rajiv Gandhi University in 2007 for her thesis on the novels of Lumbar Dai and Yeshe Dorji Thongchi. Seven of her books have been published till date, some of which are Ethnic Worlds in Select Indian Fictions and Ethnicity in the Fiction of Lumbar Dai and Yeshe Dorji Thongchi, a new historist approach, among many others. We are delighted to have you on the panel, ma'am. Thank you for joining us. We will now open the forum for discussion. I would request Dr. Churchill to share his insights. Sir, over to you now.
Well, thank you. This is a very interesting panel, and I'm the old guy of the group. Also, a focus on literature has been secondary in my work to a considerable extent, although there's also a considerable overlap with cinema, film, which I focused on somewhat more extensively. But with regard to stereotyping of indigenous peoples of North America in terms of literary output, I think you can probably pick that up with the first novels published in the first quarter of the 19th century by James Fenimore Cooper. Notably, the famous ones would be Last of the Mohicans, which is a total misrepresentation of almost everything. It was really about white settler colonials, their attitudes and outlooks, as opposed to what you could really call a one-dimensional savage stereotype of the Hurons. This is set in 1763, as I recall. Hurons as a people really hadn't existed for the better part of a century at that point. They were fragmented, shattered, uh, absorbed in large part by other peoples, had moved. He's really casting the thing for historiographical purposes with a prior. There was not a single French and Indian War, as it was called. There was a whole series of them, four major ones that lasted well over a century. He was really reaching back to prior war and casting that into 1763 for whatever literary reason, I guess currency. But the indigenous people who resisted the colonial invasion were cast, as I say, one dimensionally, essentially as hordes of howling savages, manifest evil, and so forth, given no particular motive or motivation, humanization at all. And that carries forward. Now, that overlap that I was talking about with cinema is not everybody, although you're often assigned it in secondary school in the United States to read Fenimore Cooper, one or more of his novels. There's a whole series, as I say, Last of the Mohegans being the most famous. And incidentally, The Last of the Mohegans couldn't possibly have been the last. You can go to Wisconsin to find the remnants of that people, which is resurgent to this day. They were never reduced to the extent that he portrayed it in the novel. Essentially, that was a maudlin celebration of extinction and the fate that was being projected for all indigenous peoples. That was not entirely inaccurate, although nobody, in the sense that he was talking about it, really became extinct. And indigenous people never completely died out. Then there's a lot of manipulation of the counts and so forth in reality. But it's the portrayal. And you have this whole evolution of the literary tradition where Indians are never really human beings. They're props for the important drama or melodrama that's being played out by the settler society. So Indians are assigned roles as a vanishing savage, kind of romantic. It's playing on maudlin sensibilities. The example that occurs to me is Black Hawk and the way that was depicted in literature, and on the basis of depiction in literature, which resonated with the sensibilities of the settler population, the invading population, the occupying or conquering population. They like to fancy themselves as conquerors. Black Hawk was driven into Wisconsin, and then his people were slaughtered, massacred at the Bad Axe River, and his skull ended up on display in a dentist's office in Iowa for a couple of generations, or at least one. And today we have a hockey team named the Blackhawks in Chicago. I don't know what you would make of that, but it would be, in a way, kind of like, the Berlin soccer team being named the Rabbis or whatever, or named after a famous Jew who was exterminated sometime in the early 1940s, for example. And we have this statue of Black Hawk gazing across the river in northern Illinois towards Iowa as if that was a place he was yearning to abandon his own homeland in order to arrive at, in order to have his skull made on display. And the literary strain also goes in the comic veins, where Indians, kind of famously or infamously, as you will, is a novel, Nobody Loves a Drunken Indian, about a fictional group of Paiutes headed by Chief Flap. The movie that is made from this, starring Anthony Quinn, is called Flap. These Paiutes discover a treaty which entitles them or acknowledges their rights to the territory, which includes the city of Phoenix, and they head out southward from where their reservation is to reclaim the city. Guess they had themselves confused with being settler colonists themselves, arriving at the shore, driving the spear into the ground, and claiming the territory and all of its inhabitants in the name of what? I'm not entirely sure. Very confused, but it's portrayed as a comedy, and these are comic characters. Bob Hope, in another Hollywood version, manifestation of the literature, firing a gun, and a whole row of Indians falls over. And as Charlie Hill, the Oneida comic, once put it, kind of a casual way of treating genocide, don't you think? And more seriously, Hollywood cinema picks up on the novels of Alan LeMay, which really have to be read to be believed, because I've read the Nazi literature, um, looking at the Third Reich, as I have rather intensively in various dimensions over the course of my career. The things that were being said as a matter of course, defining the sensibility of average Germans with regard to Jews, is reflected amply in Alan LeMay's novels, on which The Searchers, which is a classic, considered to be a classic of the Hollywood Western cinema. Also, The Unforgiven, but there lines in there like this mixed blood adopted sister of the white brothers in Unforgiven having filth in her brain, or excuse me, filth in her veins, uh, that filth being Indian blood. So there's this dehumanization by, well, it's clearly othering, but it's the reduction to one dimension or less, turning indigenous people, in terms of discourse of the colonizing population, into essentially a form of flora or fauna, which is sometimes dangerous, sometimes comedic, sometimes sentimentally romantic, but nonetheless an impedance to progress that needs to be eliminated. The continuous tone of this over a century and a half, I know everything's supposedly changing a bit now, but I can read more current literature than I've remarked about in these very brief comments and find echoes, find resonance, find a continuation of the sorts of themes that I'm talking about. But I think perhaps, given the limitations of time here, maybe I should stop talking now, give the other panelists an opportunity to have their say, and we'll get on to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Churchill. That was a very insightful speech that you have given, and especially when you said that Indians, like in terms of popular culture or even in terms of say movies, like how Indians, they are never treated as human beings but are props. They are assigning certain roles, be it savages or comics. And like at the top of my mind, I actually remember about this movie called Bahubali. It is a very famous South Indian movie, and we see similar roles assigning to the Indian indigenous community, and it is quite sad to say how the same sort of uh, same same sort of thought process, how they are like resonating across cultures. So thank you, sir. uh, I would now request Dr. Chaudhary to share her insights. Ma'am, over to you now.
Thank you, Shramana. It was great listening to Professor Churchill on his views about literary stereotypes of indigenous community. Well, every literary work portrays the culture and tradition of a group or groups of people. In the literary tradition of India, we do not find many works, I think, written in the English language, which are focused on the lives of indigenous communities or their culture and tradition. We do, however, find some literary text in the regional languages, the readership of which is sadly very limited. In this context, I would like to focus upon literature from India's northeast region to highlight majorly two aspects. The first one, the dominance of the oral tradition among several tribes for a very long time, as the written word came to these communities pretty late. And number two, the growing body of literature from the region at present. Now, in connection to the first aspect of the oral tradition, we observe that most of the literature during the colonial times about the indigenous communities of India's northeast region came from the pens of the colonial masters, who recorded their experiences mostly during their sojourn in the different hills of India's northeast while they were fulfilling their administrative responsibilities. For example, I'm reminded of Major P.R.T. Gooden, who was the Deputy Commissioner of Eastern Bengal and Assam Commission. And he was also the Superintendent of Ethnography in Assam. He had recorded details about the Khasi community. There is a book too called The Khasis, which gives details about his eyewitness, whatever he has seen all throughout his sojourn in the valley. Now, there are several ethnographers and academics too who have spent many years in the region studying the life and culture of the indigenous people of India's northeast region. Examples would be probably Thomas Callan Hodgson, the first William Wise Professor of Social Anthropology at the University of Cambridge. He was notable for his writings on Indian anthropology and has written extensively on the Naga tribes. There is again John Henry Hutton, another English born anthropologist and an administrator in the Indian civil services during the period of the British Raj, and Christoph von Führer Hemmendorf, an Austrian ethnologist and professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies at London. I hope I'm not wrong in this. Who had spent 40 years studying tribal cultures of Northeast India. And both of them have also written extensively on the Naga tribes. Now, on close reading of the literature of these anthropologists, which mainly records the complete details of the tribe, various eyewitness incidents, and also the folk tales of the indigenous people, one cannot miss the essence of the otherness that we find and the stereotypical portrayal of the way of life of the indigenous community. Now, one of the major focuses that we find in these writings is the sensational record of certain cultural practices, such as headhunting, probably among the Nagas. These writings bring to mind the colonial accounts of the practice of sati, which I'm remembered of Lata Mane's book, Contentious Traditions, where she terms this kind of writings, and I quote, as frustratingly limited in their representations. Now, this is exactly the problem with the writings of the European observers on the indigenous life of India's northeast region. The limitations caused, in my opinion, by being outsiders to the community. As much time they might have spent, but they did not belong to the community. This brings us to the second aspect of this talk, which I had mentioned before, the growing body of literature of authors who belong to this region. Now, I would like to focus on the writings of two authors, particularly to highlight the difference that the perspective of an insider can make. These two authors, my favorites are Isterin Kayer Iralu from Nagaland and Mamang Dai from Arunachal Pradesh. Now, Kayer's focus in all her novels has been the portrayal of the cultural practices and traditions of the Angami Naga tribe that she belongs to. Her books, the ones which are very prominent in this, for example, the book When the River Sleeps, or The Sky is My Father, or the one called Don't Run My Love, they all proudly present the legacy of a tribe which henceforth, which before had not been portrayed in creative writings in the English language, from that particular place. The presentation of indigenous community in these works are very realistic without being sensational. They're very captivating without being stereotypical. Similar, I find in Mamangdai's books, a very prominent ones are the Legends of Pensam and the Black Hill, which similarly record the oral tradition of the Adi tribe without being apologetic of the indigenous beliefs and practices. Now, the literary works of these authors are, I feel, like breath of fresh air amidst the otherwise stereotypical representations of indigenous communities of India's northeast region. It will be injustice if I do not mention another favorite writer of mine, Padma Shri Dr. Temsula Au, whom we lost very recently, I think last October, 22 October, a very noted Naga author and ethnographer. Her works are very realistic representations of the Ao Naga tribe. She presents the various shades of human character. Some of her women characters are privileged women, others are not. Now, there's a very general belief that women in Northeast India are very privileged and less exploited. Such beliefs probably are a product of media creation, and they contribute, in my opinion, to the construction of stereotypes. Authors like Temsula Au, Isterin Kaya Iralu, Mamang Dai, and many more in today's time from India's Northeast region are systematically breaking the stereotypes through their literature. So we have Kaya's portrayal of a powerful grandmother figure in her book, another favorite of mine called A Terrible Matriarchy. Uh, this grandmother figure strongly believes that girls didn't need an education. They didn't need love and affection or time to play or even a good piece of meat with their gravy. Now, see how this book breaks the stereotype that women in indigenous communities in India's northeast have an upper hand always in their family or the larger community. Now, Kaya shows how a young Angami girl faces exploitation and discrimination, not from the men of her family or from the larger community per se, or from any external factor, but from our own grandmother, a woman. I would like to end my brief talk by highlighting the fact that the need for more people is really required from indigenous communities to tell the stories of their tribes, their culture and tradition, so that these stories, I feel, should not be lost over time. And more importantly, they should be in a position to contest the stereotypical representations of their own people, which otherwise, may dominate the minds of the readers. With this, I'll end my talk. I'm very eager to listen to Dr. Judy Datta after having listened to Professor Ward Churchill. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Dhuri? Yes, yes. Thank you very much, Dr. Chaudhary. I'm really sorry. There was some internet connection issues from my end. Uh, really sorry about that. But thank you so much for this very perspective talk that you have given, and how you have shown the very strong juxtaposition between the narratives given out from a colonial point of view, and then from the point of view of a person who belongs to the tribal context. Thank you very much, ma'am. I would now request Dr. Datta to share her insights. Ma'am, over to you.
Thank you. It is really nice to listen to Professor Ward Churchill, Dr. Pyle, Dr. Chaudhary. In fact, Dr. Chaudhary's talk that she was talking about this anthropological writings of Northeast India. She has started with this colonial time, and then she has talked about Temsula Au, Mamang Dai, Zistiran, Kiru, and then all this I'll be talking about something specifically about Assam. Actually, this Assamese ethnic literature, and another point that which I'd like to mention here, that I'll be giving few examples from Assamese text, ethnographic text with novel specifically, and this novel are written uh, by writers who do not belong to that community. They are not the insiders in that sense. Let me begin by a quotation by Murdoch, Graham Murdoch. Uh, we also need to ask who orchestrated this representation. Who is licensed to talk about other people's experience? Who is empowered to ventriloquize other people's opinions? Who is mandated to picture other people's lives? Who chooses who will be heard and who will be consigned to silence? Who will be seen and who will remain invisible? Who decides which viewpoint will be taken seriously and how conflicts between positions will be resolved? Who proposes explanations and analysis and is subject to them? When we discuss about stereotyping in indigenous communities, it is stereotyping someone on the basis of his or her ethnic origin. To discuss about stereotyping of indigenous communities in literature, I would like to mention an Assamese novel, Mirijeri, which is chronologically the third Assamese novel. Mirijeri is a novel based on the missing community of Assam, and it is written by Rajanikanta Bordoloi and published in 1894. For us, for the modern day readers, uh, certain aspects of Mirijeri seem to be undemocratic. At the same time, it can be said that in Mirijeri, the novelist presents a romanticized picture of stereotypically quote unquote naive and simple tribe. Mirijeri is a historically important literary text in more ways than one. At a point when no other writer from Assam ever thought of straining his eyes beyond the caste Hindu community, Bordoloi tried to represent the society of the Mishing tribe through fiction. No doubt, Bordoloi breaks new grounds. In spite of being a cultural quote unquote outsider to the missing tribe, Bordoloi was a careful but distant observer, a charmed spectator of the tribal community. The deliberate use of the term charmed spectator speaks volume about how indigenous community is looked at by an author who is a cultural outsider. Uh, in Mirijeri, Rajnikanta Bordoloi, who himself is a upper class caste Hindu, talks about the member of the missing community as they. When he talks about this group of indigenous people, he detaches himself from the community he is talking about. Moreover, Bordoloi uses many derogatory adjectives stereotypical notions about the particular community to describe the people of the Mishing community. While accepting the historical importance of marriagery, such stereotyped notions of the indigenous community can hardly be overlooked. I'll talk about another novel. It is written by an cultural outsider. In a novel which is written by an outsider, the presentation, or we must say, representation of ethnic life and society seems more important than the characterization of the plot. Uh, um, uh, in Pashupati Bharadwaj Simchang or Duty Par, that means the two sides of the Simsang River, Garo life and rituals are pictured. However, the readers are introduced neither to the core problem of the ethnic community of the Garos nor to any particular character of the community. And there is another famous name in the field of Assamese ethnographic fiction, that is Swarna Bora. And she wrote few novels based on ethnic societies of Assam. Her Simsang Nodir Hahi, The Smile of Simsang River, and Deung Nodir Git, The Song of Deung River. Both these novels are based on the Garo and the Dimasa lives and societies. In these novels, the novelist tries to bring about a sense of unity among different communities, ethnic or non-ethnic. There is no particular issue relating to any ethnic community that the novelist tries to address. Here, the writer looks at the ethnic communities from an outsider's perspective, or from the position of someone belonging to quote-unquote more developed societies. Simsang Nadir Hahi showcases the traditional Garo society in terms of its beliefs and customs. While talking about the worship of evil spirit for recovery of diseases, about the age-old customs, beliefs, and superstitions, it is stereotyping of indigenous communities. This is the indigenous community we see, we can think of, and we can depict. And in most cases, the indigenous communities are looked at as something what Tilottama Mishra has termed this word strange and exotic. Are looked at something strange and exotic by an outsider writer, a writer who is a cultural outsider and who doesn't belong to that community. His is I would like to quote, this is also a term by Mishra, that his is an alien gaze. So when we talk about tribal literature, I think we mean literature that represent tribal life and society. So it's not like important whether tribal literature or writings that is by a tribal writer or a non-tribal writer. So when we talk about tribal representation in literature, it not necessarily mean either by insider or outsider. Indigenous people remain highly stereotyped in literature, in folk tales and folk songs. Already been talked about this oral literature. So in folk tales and folk songs, there are mentions of stereotyped notions of indigenous people. In Assamese folk songs, in Assamese Bihu songs, also in Assamese folk tales, there we have plenty of such stereotyped mentions of indigenous people. And I would like to come to the conclusion about like what we would I'd like to conclude with few talking about few stereotyping traps, like how do we see literally stereotyping is done in the literature. How do we write it? That there are few stereotyping traps, like by romanticizing the characters of particular community, like tribal people, simple tribal people, all naive and pure, very good, naive people, simple people, ethereal beings sometimes. And there are like beautiful women sometimes this beauty is associated with something unexplainable. That I remember that Yama is a character in the Sahitya Academy Award-winning novel Mauna Mukhar Hidoy, and she is like she is so beautiful that she is considered as, oh, she cannot be a human being, she is divine, she is an ethereal being. And of course, another point, like if we look back to our epic Mahabharata, then that indigenous warrior that is very fierce and formidable and a threat to civilized society, that is there in even in the character of Ghattukas. We can see that this is also stereotyped that way. And then if we think about historical and cultural inaccuracies, that can also be like called as an stereotype, as a trap, as a stereotyping traps, like. And this, that people have a tendency to look at indigenous people and to talk about indigenous people in common terms, common, like in one who is an outsider of the indigenous community tend to refer to the different people of different community as one indigenous community. When we talk about uh, indigenous people of Northeast India, then as if Northeast India, that all the that is only one term that is used, Northeast India. So there are different types in the and different communities. So there, as they have different food habits, different customs, different dresses. So these are overlooked, not only in media, in literature, even in our common day-to-day life talking. And then another stereotyping trap, I believe, that it is stereotyping by omission and decentering. In most cases, we see that in a novel or in a drama, there are tribal characters either to entertain the audience or for a minor role in the in a so-called uh, quote unquote mainstream text. Tribal characters are not portrayed as an important personality to be analyzed critically. And another stereotyping trap that I can say, that simplistic characteristics, like perhaps most destructive to the image of indigenous people is the lack of character and personality as portrayed in literature. Rarely in indigenous character and is an indigenous character portrayed as having personal strength and weaknesses, or shown like with their own values and judgments and all. Thank you. This is what I would like to share.
Thank you so much, ma'am. That was a very piercing and a very thoughtful discourse. And thank you so much for starting the speech with that very powerful statement that you'd given, like who is licensed, and it definitely talks about the power dynamics between the tribal and the non-tribal communities. Thank you so much, ma'am. We will now move on to the question and answer session. So I would first like to start with Dr. Churchill. Sir, the term easy squay is a derogatory and offensive term that has historically been used to demean and stereotype indigenous women, particularly in North America. How has it been used to objectify and sexualize indigenous women, perpetuating harmful stereotypes that undermine their dignity and agency? Sir, you are on mute, I think.
Yes.
Yes. Let me try this again. Myriad ways, but mostly I would have to say demeaning, devaluing, lowering, commodifying. But I think perhaps the clearest example is the use of the term squaw, Squaw, which, well, there's two major schools of thought that it's a corruption of a Algonquian term, squaw, for a female leader, usually an elder woman, endowed with wisdom, who essentially has a powerful voice in determining the direction that will be pursued by her people. That's one. The other is that it is a slight corruption of a Mohawk word referring to female genitalia. The female genitalia, I've been corrected on having used a squaw interpretation, that it is a devaluation, in a way, of a very honorable status within an indigenous society by a society in which women have been demeaned and devalued historically by the so-called patriarchy. I think perhaps the weight of the argument goes to the Mohawk interpretation. So, okay, squaw is a kind of a slang or flip term for an indigenous woman. I'm not talking about it being a Mohawk woman. I'm talking about any indigenous woman, insofar as there is discourse, gender discourse in the settler canon. There are also something like 1,300 place names in the United States that incorporate that word: Squaw Valley, Squaw Mountain, Squaw Creek, not just one place, but in several. Okay, variations on that theme. So that in the popular sensibility, squaw and Indian woman are interchangeable. But like I say, it's a corruption of a term referring to anatomical reality on the one hand, but not used in that sort of scientific or pseudoscientific sense, but as a slang term referring to women. I can and have had numerous arguments about intentionality there and whether that should really be considered as offensive as it is taken by indigenous women in general and indigenous men, indigenous people for that matter, okay, by purported feminists in the settler society. Yeah, that's probably wrong, but there's more important things to deal with. If, on the other hand, we were to refer to them with English language slang for exactly the same portion of anatomy, referring to them, I'm not even going to say the terms. And that says something in itself, because I did say squaw. So the offense that would be taken if that were a matter of common usage in the discourse in the academy and popular literature in terms of place names, in terms of just a general perception of the place and value of women in the settler society, you'd have those same reported feminists up in arms, perhaps literally up in arms, but certainly not engaging in civil discourse and wanting to argue that perhaps the degree of offense that is taken outstrips the significance of the issue. That in itself takes all indigenous people and places them on a lower rung of value, humanity, and involves an entitlement, self-entitlement, by the dominant society as a whole, dominating society as a whole, to continue dehumanizing, devaluing, degrading, demeaning Indian women in particular and Indian people in general. That's not an historical reality. It's a common, current reality. They have begun to change some place names, but it's a struggle every time because of the tradition. Well, it's been named that for a long time. People are used to it. It's got all of that. And it takes its place in a whole vernacular that accomplishes the same thing, although perhaps not in quite so virulent a manner, at least not so sexualized a manner, which involves the sports team mascots, the Redskins football team, which is now the Commanders. They finally took the name off. The Cleveland Indians baseball team, they've removed that name as well, as I understand it. The issue there being a visual portrayal of the Indian, which was virtually interchangeable with the Julius Streicher cartoon from the Third Reich, depicting your stereotypical Jew from the Nazi point of view. But Jeep Cherokees, Hiawatha pencils, Big Chief writing tablets, the TP Motel, continuing product names. People long ago figured out that Sambo's restaurants were probably, that was an ill-advised name because it was demeaning and degrading to African-descended people here. With Indians, not so. Fritz Scholder put out a book. Well, he gave it a sort of benign title. He called it Indian Kitsch. And it's just Polaroid photo after Polaroid photo after Polaroid photo that he took while driving, not looking for these things, but just driving around the country. An entire book of images encountered at roadside of this kind of trivialization, dehumanization, devaluation of indigenous peoples as something other than people deserving of dignity, much less rights like self-determination and so on. So it's a matrix of rationalization, justification, psychologically, intellectually, of maintenance of a colonial status quo. And understand, every square inch of the territorial corpus of the United States is land taken from indigenous people, and every indigenous nation retaining a land base under the federal government is a nation recognized in constitutional and international law as such on the basis of treaty relationships, which is totally subordinated to the central government of the United States. They are allowed to make decisions insofar as they comport with federal guidelines and objectives, but have no real capacity to take anything that is any decision contrary to the interests of the United States. That's not any of the euphemisms that would be used and are used to disguise the situation. That is internal colonialism. That is settler state colonialism. Colonization continues. When people are denied the right to determine for themselves within the parameters of their own traditions on their own land, utilizing their own resources, it is colonialism. Colonialism is not something that you can describe as being post, as in after the effect, when it is in fact ongoing, at least as regards with indigenous peoples. But I would argue with regard to all peoples of color in North America. I will not speak the context with which I'm not especially familiar, but I suspect that you have some sort of a same situation in India. As I understand it, you got 300 different defined nationalities, nations there, but I don't know of any of them outside of the central government of India that is genuinely self-determining. and it's incomprehensible to the bulk of the population that that would be a significant issue. And that's what I mean about demeaning and trivializing, and that's the function of all this that we're talking about. We cannot unlock the implications of sexual degradation from the overall structure of the colonial order. So the key here is colonization, the various facets by which it is maintained and rationalized and justified in the minds of the colonizers and often of the colonized themselves are simply the analytical ingredients to understanding the whole, and the whole is the ongoing reality of colonialism. Again, now I'll stop. I think I've gone a fair ways down the track from the original question, but that's where it leads me. So I thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for the answer. I have another question for you. This question is related to your 2001 essay titled On the Justice of Roosting Chickens. So, in this essay, you have discussed the 9/11 terrorist attacks and argued that they were a response to US foreign policy rather than an unprovoked act of terrorism. This has sparked intense debates about academic freedom, freedom of speech, and the responsibilities of professors in expressing their views. So, do you feel that the path towards intellectual freedom differs for the indigenous communities in North America?
It does, to the extent that indigenous people's indigenous voice is essentially invisibilized, silenced. My own experience with that particular aspect of things is that anyone framing things in the fashion that I have been framing them today, although I've been sharper on point, more blunt oftentimes than I have been today, anyone taking that particular line, calling things by their right names, is apt to be repressed and silenced. Things have evolved quite a lot along this trajectory since my particular situation and that of Norman Finkelstein and several other contemporaneous figures. Look at Florida, or you look to what they're trying to do in Arizona and other states with the totally misfocused attacks on critical race theory and so forth. Anything that deals with the idea that there's a structural component of racism in the U.S. order is to be silenced. And that includes not simply in the classroom, but in libraries. And they're working very hard on popular media as well, although that's got there's a little bit of a contradiction going on because you've got venues like this, you've got the ability to stream and to make videos, documentaries, and so forth that can be very much on point. And they can't quite contain them, but they'll keep them out of the main theaters and off the main television feeds and so forth. But there's a cartoon of the Keepers of Order that came out in the late 1960s with all these little student types running out the gates of the university's order and central administration with basically a large butterfly net, large figure, trying to capture them as they ran in all directions, and it was an impossible task. One hopes that's true, but yeah, there's very much a concerted drive to silence an alternative oppositional, or whatever you want to call it, discourse in the United States. And, you're going to have to simply acknowledge that and perhaps return to the venues that marked the earlier part of the 20th century when the intelligentsia, the intellectual opposition, was lodged not in formal institutional structures, but in community, organic intellectuality, if you will. I think that applies to people of all groups, colonized in particular, but people from the colonizing population who've seen through a lot of this mask and obfuscation that goes on to rationalize and justify colonization. They too will be silenced. Norman Finkelstein is Jewish, not indigenous here, and he was silenced just as effectively as I was. So, in a way, you could look at us as being prototypes for what they are setting about doing on a national scale at this point. Academic freedom has always been a myth. You were free to say things within assigned parameters, but if you went beyond those boundaries and really called things flat out, say it's unjustifiable, indefensible, and has to be changed, and mean it, and people begin to listen to you, they go after you. They go after you, whether they were called McCarthyites or whether they were back to the Palmer raids or whatever in U.S. history. So we're at that particular point now where academic freedom is being rendered an irrelevant concept other than mythology that exists and the comfort that can be taken in that. That would be pretty much all I'd have to say on that.
Thank you so much, sir. I would like to Dr. Chaudhuri now for the Q&A session. Ma'am, the first question for you is manufacturing consent is a concept coined by the American linguist and political activist Noam Chomsky and the Canadian philosopher and media scholar Edward S. Herman. It refers to the way in which the mass media and other institutions in a society shape public opinion and promote certain narratives and agendas. How may we examine the manufacture of consent considering modern Indian literature, paying particular attention to indigenous people or Adivasis and their customs and way of life?
Thank you for the question, Shramana. I think Chomsky and Herman's concept of manufacturing consent is related to the mass communication media of the US. Being powerful ideological institutions that carry out a systematic supportive propaganda function by reliance on market forces, internalized assumptions, and self censorship without, of course, overt coercion and by means of the propaganda model of communication. Now, let me connect this to the portrayals of India's Northeast region and its indigenous people in media and literature, which was the focus of my talk today. Now, we find that such portrayals highlight the stereotypical image of the region's troubled political climate, violence, backwardness, underdevelopment, and so called poverty. Now, the strong political awareness, issues related to identity and ethnicity, violence in different forms, and above all, the shadow of the gun, are some of the real life problems, not only of India's Northeast region, but I feel are common everywhere. And can hardly be ignored by writers of the region. Now, however, the argument that I would like to make is that the Northeast Indian experience is not limited only to this so called realities, moving away from the shackles of the obvious stereotypes. I feel one cannot but bask in the glory of the vibrant legacy of the place, its people, their cultures and traditions. And I can say that very proudly, being, somebody who belongs to this region. So yes, mass media and literature do contribute to manufacturing consent, particularly in the case of India's Northeast region. But as I mentioned in my concluding remarks during my talk, we need to contest the stereotypes by bringing in authentic indigenous voices to tell the stories from insiders' point of view. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the answer, ma'am. My second question for you is what are the impacts of stereotyping on indigenous communities' self perception, cultural identity, and social well being?
I think that's a very good question, Shravana. See, stereotypes which exist over a long period of time, they pose a problem of being accepted as reality. Similar is the case with the identity of indigenous communities. What happens is over time, when generations after generations of people are told that this is your identity, this is the way you are, there are all chances that such stereotypes will come to be believed as facts. Indigenous communities are, many a times vulnerable for various reasons. So, imposing upon them a manufactured identity, which we just, I spoke about now, not really their own, has all possibilities of impacting their self perception, cultural identity, and social being in a very negative way. Having said that, I'm very happy that at present the Indian government is taking a lot of initiatives to preserve and promote our rich indigenous knowledge system, which in turn is sure to make inroads into the creation of a positive image of indigenous communities of our country among today's generation. That is what I'm very happy about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I would now move on to our last speaker, Dr. Jury Datta. Ma'am, the first question for you is how do Indigenous authors and communities reclaim their narratives and challenge stereotypes through their own literary works?
Mm, oh, when it comes to the issue of challenging stereotypes, one of the most important, most crucial development that has happened in recent times is the entry of large number of assertive ethnic writers, particularly in the context of India, uh, who have enabled to challenge the stereotypes and also uh, assert some of the traditional ways of expression, which have been for a long time marginalized. And so they this new group of writers, when I say new group of writers like Jacinta Karkata from Jharkhand, and we can say Mamang Dai from Arunachal Pradesh, those is not that new. But in the context of Northeast India, for instance, she has been a powerful voice who has resisted the stereotypes of the that I have already mentioned, the simple, naive, unthinking kind of travel that she has challenged. She has been able to do this by using an idiom that is rooted in the folklore of Arunachal Pradesh, and that is the best part. She has not been relied on necessarily Western structure or Western narrative, Western style of narration to put across her points. She made her points very powerfully by making use of Arunachali folklore. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. My second question for you today is tribal tourism, also known as indigenous tourism or cultural tourism, refers to a form of tourism that focuses on visiting and engaging with indigenous or tribal communities. What role does the commodification of indigenous culture and traditions play in reinforcing stereotypes in tribal tourism?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. It's a very nice question I'd like to answer. Actually, this commodification has a huge role to play in strengthening stereotypes. Uh, we are placed in an extremely difficult situation right now when it comes to question of tourism. On the one hand, we are of course, acutely aware of the fact that in the context of our times, culture cannot be separated from economy or question of livelihood. Culture has to be related to questions of livelihood. Uh, I mean, there cannot be culture bearers who carry the burden of culture for its own sake without any conscience, any regard for their livelihood. We have to think about ways of creating, ways of striking a balance between these two. Uh, because there is always the danger whenever there is commodification that the authenticity of culture is in jeopardy, for different reasons. Firstly, of course, there is the fear of decontextualization, simply for the sake of attracting tourist interest, or we can say sustaining tourist interest. There is the possibility that very often cultural practices are taken out of the context, and and they are presented kind of completely decontextualized setting, which is extremely detrimental in so far as the question of authenticity are questions of authenticity are concerned. Having said this, this is an issue of great ethical dilemma, in the sense that this has to be done for the sake of livelihood, because we also have to be conscious of how this can lead to the satisfaction of tourists who are looking for an authentic ethnic experience. So a balance has to struck has between these two. And so, like, I mean, I have no easy solution for this. The problem, I think, there will be a hint of stereotyping every time there is a performance being staged, keeping the tourist in mind. But I think it is a question of degree to what extent we are able to stop this, and to what extent we allow this to happen. And uh, whatever we do, we should be mindful of the fact that the interest and feelings of the community concerned is not hard, and their ideas and their thoughts about this is always taken into consideration. Because being active bearers of culture, they are the ones who will finally take a call on this. And I don't think it is for an outsider to either say that it is improper to rely on to completely prevent commodification, because, as I said, it's related to questions of their livelihood. So that will happen, that is bound to happen. At the same time, we also cannot allow a complete hold or complete sway of this commodification, which goes to the extent of completely demolishing the indigenous way of life, indigenous ways of life. So I think there has to be a right balance, and the right balance has to be decided by the community itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. This brings us to the end of today's session. I thank all the panelists once again for sharing their invaluable perspectives on the topic. This is to remind that we are calling for submissions on tribal literature and tribal representation in literature, the details of which can be viewed on www.tellmeyourstory.biz. We will come back to you soon with our next panel discussion on the project. Till then, good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.